for elders and deacons. Now, those of you, when you were in high school and college, if you like social studies, if you like history, if you like political science, this is going to be an interesting sermon for you because that's what we're going to be talking about. However, for those of you who didn't particularly care for history or political science, there's a reason why you need to be engaged in today's message because it's so relevant to you. And I'm going to use the analogy of a U.S. citizenship. Okay, I would venture to say that most of you here are American citizens. In fact, we have two brothers that you all know, Marcus, who is the head usher, and Kevin. Where's Kevin? Oh, he's in the AV room. They both were so excited. They became U.S. citizens in this past year. And by becoming a U.S. citizen, your privilege is in November. You could vote. Now, of course, the big election is next November for the presidency. But I remember for both of these brothers, right before they go to their citizenship interview, they asked their friends for prayer. They were so worried about the exam. And, we told them, now, you need to know the three branches of the U.S. government, right? That there's the executive branch. The president gets elected once every 4 years. And in the Congress, well, you have two houses. The senators have a longer term, 6 years, whereas a congressman, they have to get reelected every 2 years. And you also need to know how the Supreme Court justices are elected. As you know, they're not really elected. They are appointed. So my analogy is they were so excited to be citizens of the United States, and they need to know the basic form of government in the United States so they know how to vote for it. Okay. My point is, I know all of you well, or some better than others. We now have 80% of you are members of CCCNJ, and you'll see an announcement. For those of you who are not members yet, I invite you to come to my class today at 1:30, and I'll explain to you the benefits and privileges and the expectations, what the Bible teaches about being a member of the church. So having said that, for the 80% of you who are members of CCCNJ, next month in October, we are going to have what's called the General Assembly, and the members are asked to vote to elect new deacons and trustees. And that's why today's message on elders and deacons are very important. Oh, by the way, we have some visitors here from other churches. So even if you're from other church, I think you should know how your church government is structured. And nowadays, especially in America, there are positions called elders or pastors or priests and deacons. So I think this should be a very important basic lesson for all of us. Okay, so let me give you a quick history lesson. I will talk about history, because we all need to know how God intended the human beings to be ruled. And that was theocracy. So the God's form of government in the Old Testament was theocracy. Do you know what theocracy means? The dictionary defines theocracy as a system of government in which the priests rule in the name of God. And so from the time of Moses, and you remember how God called Moses to come up to Mount Sinai. He gave them the 10 Commandments, right? The rules of living that governs moral rules, that governs civil rules, and that governs social rules. Besides the 10 Commandments, the Jewish people has 613 regulations. So God gave that directly to Moses, and Moses basically ruled his people the way God wanted him to. And many of you from your Sunday school class, you know that the Israelites had 12 tribes, right? And many of you know that one tribe, the Levites, was specifically called the tribe of priests, right? So that it's a system of government, theocracy, and the Levites were supposed to be the intermediaries between the people and God. Okay, so that kind of worked well during this. I took the scene from the 10 Commandments of Charlton Heston and Joshua. It worked well from Moses' time up until Joshua, but just 2 generations, because many of you know, after Joshua and his generation had a lot of success from the Battle of Jericho and defeated all the enemy Canaanites and took over the promised land that God gave them, I think many of you know, because Pastor Jane has preached a whole series on Judges, this statement. The last verse in Judges says, in those days, after Joshua passed away, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So it was bad in Judges. It was always rebellion, sin, punishment. They cry out for mercy, then God sends them a judge, and it was just a repetitious cycle all around. So many of you, again, if you went to Sunday school, you know that the children of Israel say, hey, Prophet Samuel, all the other countries around us, they have a king. Why don't we have a king? We want a king too. And just like some of the protests you're seeing around the world, they protested, and God relented, and God told Samuel, okay, all right, they want a king, I will give them a human king. But it's really interesting because if you read through the Old Testament, at least in the beginning, the way God wanted to, the very first king of Israel, many of you know, was Saul. God actually appointed. It wasn't done through democratic election. God appointed that king. Now, let's go to the early church government, the New Testament now. In the New Testament, from the book of Acts, we know that the apostles started this church of Christ, followers of Jesus Christ. And a definition of apostle is somebody who had been called by and have actually, the real definition was met with Jesus Christ. So the way the New Testament church started off is Jesus himself commissioned the 12 disciples to be the apostles and elders and leaders of the church. And in Acts chapter 6, we also learn the formation of the second office in the church. So there's the office of the elders, and then there's the office of the deacons. So I don't know if you can see this well or not, but the deacons are reporting under the apostles, the elders, because their function was to be assistants to the elders. And I'll read to you from Acts chapter 6. Just a quick background. So the disciples started to follow Jesus Christ. The early church was formed. The leader of every church was the 12 disciples, like James or John or Philip or Apostle Paul. Then especially Apostle Paul would go on missionary journeys, and when he went to Ephesus, he started a church there. When he went to Colossae, he started a church there. When he went to Corinth, he started a church there. And since Paul couldn't be at different places all at the same time, he himself, as the lead apostle, appointed another elder like Timothy to say, Timothy, this is your job. Be the pastor of Ephesus. Okay? So pastors and elders are used interchangeably. But many of you know the home church, the headquarters was Jerusalem, right? So after Jesus ascended to heaven, the home church in Jerusalem got big. It was great. They were converting more people, and more people were coming. And then in Acts chapter 6 and verse 1, we are told that as the number of people in that church grew, the apostles noticed that the widows, especially the widows of Greek or Hellenic heritage, were being neglected in their daily food distribution. Priority was given to the Jewish widows. So this was brought to the elders' attention, and then they said, okay, we need to do something because the 12 of us cannot take care of all these administrative duties. So here's what it says in verse 2. So the 12 gathered all the disciples together and said, it would not be right for us to neglect the ministry of the word of God in order to wait on tables. Brothers and sisters, choose 7 men from among you who are known to be full of the Spirit and wisdom. We will turn this responsibility over to them, and we'll give our attention to prayer and the ministry of the word. Formation of the deacons in the New Testament. The Greek word deacon, diakonos, literally means servant or someone who waits on tables. And that's exactly what was the first function that the apostles needed. You know, we need to spend most of our time to preach and teach and to pray and minister to the people spiritually. So, hey, deacons, some spiritually wise men in our church, you need to take care of waiting on tables and serving the people in the church. That's exactly the function of what the deacons should be. Now, let's go on. So now I want to present to you, there's 4 major types of church government, okay? Because the early church from 120 grew to thousands, and then when in the year 8312, when the Emperor Constantine of Rome became a Christian himself, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman kingdom. And that's where the whole Pope and all the structures happened. So you know that, by the way, there's 2 billion Christians right now of all Christian denominations. So that's a lot of people. So in order to rule 2 billion people, you have to have a structure bigger than just 2 layers and 7 deacons, right? So this is important for you to know. One type of government is called the Episcopalian government, and this is the same government structure of the Catholic Church. The Pope is in charge. Underneath him are the cardinals, and those of you may have heard of Tim Dolan. He is a cardinal of New York State, right? And then if you go to any Catholic church over in Persephone, every Catholic church is headed up by a priest. Okay, so that's the structure. And the Episcopalians follow the same type of model. Okay, another type of church government is called the Presbyterian church. Some of you may have heard of Westminster Church as a seminary, and there's a lot of Presbyterian churches in the United States. Did you know that there are one major national organization where there's what's called a synod, where it's a national body of leaders? And then there's the classis, which is another group of leaders who govern and rule on a regional basis. And then when it comes to a local Presbyterian church, they call it the presbytery. But, and you can talk to Pastor Janus, in Houston, in Sugar Land, Pastor Janus is part of the Houston Presbytery, where all the Presbyterian pastors of their denomination get together and make decisions together. Okay. This is the one that you're most familiar with, because CCC&J and FCC in Randolph are part of a congregational type of church government. Okay, it's very simple. Basically, there's a congregation, there's a board of deacons, and there's a pastor. Now, most mega churches, big churches like Liquid or Hillsong, or they are most likely a congregational church government. The reason why is because, and it's part of the success of these mega churches, is all you need is a very charismatic, strong senior pastor, and he can make all the decisions about which church building to buy, how to structure the worship programs. It's one pastor making a lot of decisions, and there's a board of deacons or the board of elders to keep that person accountable. Then there's also an elder-led church type of government. This is very similar to the congregational model, but here, the people who join this kind of a elder-led church is people who say, we don't trust our church policy, philosophy, ministry to be based on just one leader. What if that person loses his face or commits a scandal? That's too risky. So this type of church government is what's called the plurality of leadership, that instead of one elder or pastor leading the whole church, we will have a board of elders that will make the decisions of our church. And so if any of you have ever been to a Vineyard Church service, or sometimes it's called brethren-led churches, that's this type of model. Now that I've shared with you these 4 types of church government models, okay, I'm going to be practical and I'll summarize it for you, and you could kind of follow along in your outline, because there's pros and cons to every church government model. We cannot say one method of government is better than the other. So I will share with you the key factors, okay, that distinguishes these different types of church government. On the x-axis, or on the horizontal axis, it depends on how many decision makers are there to make major decisions for that church. Are there few or are there many? And on the y-axis, or on the vertical axis, it depends on if there is a high degree of structure, especially for a denomination that is nationwide, or is there a low degree of structure, especially if a church is just one church, one independent church. So now I put everything into play for you. I don't know if you can see this or not, but on the top left quadrant is what's called the Episcopalian structure, or It's an authoritarian structure because basically there's a high degree of structure, right? So many layers. Many of us who worked in a corporation, there's so many organization letters, and the guy, the CEO, the boss, the Pope on the top, makes all the key decisions. Some of you from the Catholic background may know that for a long time, the Catholics consider their Pope to be infallible in terms of his pronouncements, his edicts, his philosophical doctrinal statement. And the reason why is because they said the Pope is actually in a direct lineage from Apostle Peter, not biologically, but in terms of spiritual authority. So that's one type of model. On the top left side of the model is the Presbyterian model, which we also call it the hierarchist model, because there's so much hierarchy, there's so many layers, and each layer, there's a group of people who makes a decision. Some of you may work for big companies who tend to be in the hierarchical type of government structure. Now, in the bottom left-hand side is the congregational model, because we're not talking about regional or national level. It's just this one independent church. And so usually a pastor gets to make most of the decisions. So it's an individual type of model. And like I said before, the elder-led model is sort of like a democratic type of model, because it's never, the decision is not left to one person, but it's a group of elders. Okay. Now, let me try to make this practical for you, right? You need to understand, if you're a CCCNJ member, all right, we are of the congregational model. However, we don't have a senior pastor. So I personally think we operate more like the democratic model. The reason why is in CCCNJ, according to bylaws, all major decisions are made by what's called a joint board of the elders, of which we have 8, trustees, of which we have 4, and deacons, of which we have 12. So 24 people in CCCNJ, the church leaders, they have to agree on any major decision. So I think until we have a senior pastor, we're operating more like a democratic model. Okay, so let me make it relevant for you. Sometimes, almost all churches have to make some policies, such as when we have Holy Communion, who gets to participate, right? So in our church, we say, in order to participate in Holy Communion, you have to be baptized. You don't have to be baptized in church, but you have to be baptized in some church. So that's a rule of policy. Ever since the Supreme Court in the year 2015 now legalized same-sex marriage, every church had to make a decision for themselves. The Christian Missionary Alliance churches formed a policy, the Lutheran churches formed a policy, the Presbyterians formed a policy, and we were an independent church. So our church said, okay, what do we do? Like, what if a homosexual, gay, lesbian couple comes to our church and says, we love your church, so beautiful. We want to apply to rent your church to have our wedding there. What do we do? So the elder board met. We followed the Christian Mission Alliance policies to establish and put in the bylaws our belief about marriage between man and wife. And so we are legally protected. So, because our whole church stands for the definition of human sexuality according to what the Bible does. So this is just an example. I'll give you one more example. And it's a practical one. From time to time, pastors leave a church, get transferred out, retires. So at CCCNJ, who gets to decide who the new pastor is? It's actually the congregation. As many of you know, we form a search committee, and the search committee interviews and searches, researches different candidates. And if there's a candidate that we like, we bring them to appear before the elder board to make sure the doctrine is good. Then we have them meet with the leaders, and we have them meet with the interview with the members of a church, whoever wants to interview that candidate. And that pastor is not a affiliate pastor until the whole church congregation votes for it. So that's why it's very important, because officially, Pastor Joseph Wu, he has to be voted in by next month's General Assembly to be officially a pastor of CCCNJ. Right now, he is under the assistant to the pastor category. Okay. Now, if it was an elder board-led church, most likely the elders will interview and make the decision. And if you were in the Catholic Church or in the Episcopalian Church, and if a priest resigns or leaves or retires, you know what they do, right? It's an authoritarian structure. Usually the bishop will appoint, CCCNJ, you need a pastor. We have another pastor who just finished seminary, we're going to put him to be your pastor. So it's actually appointed at the higher level. So you can see the pros and cons of how these, depending on how the church is structured, how you get your pastors and how policies are formed. Now is a segue. It's very important. So because CCCNJ is a congregational church where there's the office of elders and deacons, and because many of you who are not from CCCNJ are most likely from a congregation or elder-led type of church, it's important for you to know, according to the Bible, how do we elect elders and how do we elect deacons? That's why it's very important for you to understand this passage. Okay, so Apostle Paul is telling Pastor Timothy, right? I just appointed you to be the elder pastor of Ephesus. Now you're going to need elders too, and you're going to need deacons. So this is what you do in selecting and hiring, if you will, elders and deacons. He says, here is a trustworthy saying. He says, whoever aspires to be an overseer desires a noble task. Overseers is another term for pastors and elders. So if any of you allowing yourself to, maybe someday I will be open to the idea of God calling me to be an elder or pastor, that's a good thing. It's a noble task. Now comes the requirements. And I give you the preview. There are 18 qualifications listed in this passage to becoming an elder or an overseer. Number 1, in verse 2, the overseer is to be above reproach. Above reproach means to be blameless. No scandal. You cannot be subject to anybody criticizing you for anything. Now, of course, people always criticize somebody, but after research and investigation, that you have to be above reproach. Faithful to his wife, temperate, even-tempered, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach. So in verse 2, lists all the positive things that the elders should be. And I put them into 2 categories. In yellow, I put those qualities or qualifications where it is really up to other people's opinion assessment. All right? To be above reproach, to be temperate, to be self-controlled, to be respectable. Like, I can't say, okay, I think I'm blameless, above reproach, and I'm respectable. Who are you, Paul? It's not you who decides. It's the people of this congregation, the church. It's the elders. They get to decide if you are respectable, or if you are self-controlled, or if you are temperate, or if you're respectable. So the yellow qualities are very hard because it's really not up to you to decide whether you're that or not. Now, the qualities in green are also very, very tough, but I put them in green because at least I have, or the elder candidate has some degree of control, right? I can choose to be faithful to my wife, right? I'm not going to cheat on her, right? It's up to me. I can choose to be hospitable, open our house to you, and always be welcoming and friendly to you, hospitality. And I can choose to be able to teach, right? I can study hard, I can practice, I can go to teaching conferences, teaching classes, right? So those are a little bit under my control. Now in verse 3, he talks about the negative qualities. So these are the, in my terms, I say disqualifiers. You cannot do this if you want to be an elder or a pastor. You cannot be given to drunkenness. You cannot be violent but gentle. You cannot be quarrelsome or argumentative or pugnacious. And you cannot be a lover of money. In the outline, I put down G for greedy. You cannot be greedy. Okay, let's move on. This next verse, I feel, is a deal breaker for some. It says, an elder must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him. Over these years, I've met many faithful, dedicated Christians in this church as well as other churches. Very spiritual, very much love the Lord. But sometimes they hesitate to serve because they know about this criteria. But how can I if my own children don't go to church or don't obey me? So you might say, okay, as long as my children are under my household, when they come to church, I'll make sure they obey. And if they misbehave, I'm going to make sure they know that when I get home, they're going to get a spanking if they're very small. If they're teenagers, I'm going to take the privileges of using the internet or the driver's license keys away. But Paul is smart. Paul says in the same criteria, and he must do so in a manner worthy of full respect. So Paul clearly says, elders, you have to be able to manage your own household well, and you got to do it in the manner in which you discipline and train your children is very important. It's got to be respectable, not a strong arm, domineering manner. So this is a tough category. But Paul gives the reasons why. Because in verse 5, he says, if anyone does not know how to manage his own family, then how can he take care of God's church, right? It makes sense, right? All right. Then I give you the next qualifications. The elder candidate or pastor must not be a recent convert or like a recent believer, because, actually, when people become a Christian person, they're really excited. They're gung-ho. They can be really talented as a leader. But don't make that person an elder right away, because he may become conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. Many of you, he's referring to Lucifer. Lucifer was created as the prettiest, smartest, wisest angel, the number one angel, but he became conceited. He wanted to be like God and rebelled. And that's why, since the elder position has the highest spiritual authority in the church, you cannot put a new believer, no matter how enthusiastic or no matter how gifted, into that position. And then he says in verse 7, the elder must also have a good reputation with outsiders, so that he will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap. It's also very practical, right? Many of you know, we all work in the corporate world, in the business world. Reputation takes time, right? That's why if you're working nowadays, you got to be on LinkedIn. You want to have different people write good recommendations from you. Reputation takes time to build. If you're in a business from your own thing, a lot of times you build your business through referrals, through your reputation. Same thing in the church as well. So, there's a lot of qualifications. You're not going to remember all 18. The only thing I want you to remember is this. If I need to think about if so-and-so, I'm asked to consider this person as the elder candidate, where do I go in the Bible? So I hope you remember 1 Timothy 3. And I hope you remember that when you come to this passage, there's a lot. There's 18 qualifications for an elder. And I want you to remember these two things. There's only one qualification that's based on experience, and that's in verse 6. This elder candidate must not be a recent convert. So an elder or pastor should not be a new believer. That's based on experience, right? Okay. And then there's only one qualification that Paul listed that's based on ability. He says ability to teach. That's ability. But all the other 16 qualifications, to be respectable, to be temperate, to be above reproach, they are all based on character. So I want all of you to come away, if there's only one thing you're going to remember, in God's kingdom, in God's governance, God seeks character over competence. Now, I'm not saying competence is not important. Obviously, if a potential pastor cannot preach or teach, then we should not even be considered. But the point I'm trying to make is this. God's way of doing things is so different from the world's way of doing things. And so when it comes to church governance or even the selection process of pastors and leaders of the church, it is so different from the way the world does it. So allow me, just to kind of prove my point. I see some of you here in our audience who are either working in HR, or many of you are in managerial positions where you hire people to work for you, okay? And so when you need to hire somebody, obviously you ask for resumes, right? And all of us here, when we apply for new jobs, you know that the starting point is your resume. Now, on the resume, after your name and the address and your email address, who starts out by saying, my biggest strength that I want you to consider, if you only have 1 minute to look at my resume, I am the husband of one wife. I have 3 obedient children. I'm not greedy. I don't want a big salary. Like, whoever starts off with the qualifications that Apostle Paul just listed for elders? No. In our resume, we're taught to summarize your experience, right? 30 years of executive manager experience in product management and operations and product pricing. Like, you go with your strongest experience. You go with your ability, right? So I want you all to know that we always need, as Christians, to fight hard against conforming to the world standards, which is when we want somebody to be a fellowship group leader or to be a praise team leader or to be working in the AV or usher. Human nature, we tend to look at somebody's abilities, gifts, talents, and experience. Those are all important, absolutely. But I want you to come away knowing that. But the most important thing in God's kingdom is always the character. And especially for elders, they've got to be able to practice what they preach. So that's the most important thing. And if there's any takeaway from this, please pray for the family members of pastors and elders, right? The hardest position actually is to be the pastor's wife or the PKs, the preacher's kids, because they got all that pressure upon them. And the difference of being a preacher's kids versus a deacon's kids is this. If the preacher's kids does not behave, his father may lose the job as a pastor because you're not above reproach. You can't even manage your own kids. You know, if you're deacon's kids, you have to behave, but hey, okay, so after 1 year, my dad's deacon term, and so, okay, it's sliced. So if anything, please continue to pray for the pastors, elders in your church. It's a tremendous, tremendous pressure because by definition, and it's not like the secular world or the academic world where you get a tenure. In the Christian world, the pastors, elders are judged all the time. You make one small move, criticism, the board can push you out. So it's a tough, tough position. Now, we're going to talk about the deacons now. And I still remember 2 Tuesdays ago in our YAM meeting, we had a really good debate about complementarianism versus egalitarianism, because that was the subject of my last sermon about women in ministry. And Derek is here. If you remember, in the middle of the debate, Derek said, Pastor Paul, what is the difference between the elder position and the deacon position? Remember that? And that's a great question. I will address that in today's sermon. So I'm going to answer that question. What is the difference between the deacon position and elder position? I hope you already saw the function is the deacons from Acts chapter 7. They're supposed to assist the elders so that elders can spend most of their time on the spiritual governance of preaching, teaching, prayer, and caring, so that the deacons can do the administrative stuff like maintaining the church building and doing the budget, the financial work, right? So that's the first function. But let's see what the qualification is different or not, okay? Now, Paul starts out by saying, in the same way, so that's a clue that many of the deacon qualifications are going to be similar to the elders. I already counted. Paul lists 12 qualifications for deacons, whereas he had 18 for the elders. Okay, but very similar. Look at this. Deacons are to be worthy of respect, sincere, not indulging in much wine, and not pursuing dishonest gain. Very similar to the elders. They must keep hold of the deep truth of the faith with a clear conscience. Okay, here's the first difference. The difference in qualification between the elders and deacons is this. Only the elders are expected to be able to teach doctrine. That is not a requirement for deacons. So if any of you brothers and sisters, if in the future you are asked to consider being a deacon, don't be afraid to say, oh, I don't know the Bible strong enough. I never went to seminary. That is not expected. For deacons, you'll see these qualities expected. You're not expected to be able to teach doctrine. The only thing is verse 9. It says, just be faithful to the doctrine that your faith is based upon. Okay, so that's one difference. A similar thing, they first must be tested, and then if there's nothing against them, let them serve as deacons. So in CCCNJ, before you are, your name is placed as a deacon, we want to make sure that you served in CCCNJ for at least 3 years in some sort of a co-worker position, such as you can be on the praise team, you can be on the choir, you could be a fellowship group leader, you can help coordinate and organize a retreat, you can serve on the missions committee. We want at least 3 years of testing so we know how you are in working with other people and working with the elders. And so that's exactly according to what Paul's plan is. Now, the final 2 points I'm going to make. This is similar to the elders, right? A deacon must be faithful to his wife and must manage his children and his household well. But verse 11 is not mentioned in the elder qualifications. This is what it says. In the same way, the women are to be worthy of respect, not malicious talkers, but temperate and trustworthy in everything. I'm going to share with you the 2 prevalent interpretations of this verse 11. Okay, the first interpretation is, yeah, Paul is talking about the wives of the deacons. So, deacons, you not only have to be respectable, sincere, tested, but your wives, they have to be worthy of respect and not malicious talkers, but temperate and trustworthy in everything. So that's one point of view. The other point of view says, but if Paul listed a qualification for the wives of deacons, why didn't he also list this qualification for the wives of elders? In fact, aren't the wives of elders under even more scrutiny, right? So the second interpretation says, no, verse 11, Paul is addressing female deacons. So this second view says, Paul knew that in those days, it's a very much patriarchal, man-based society, so most deacons would tend to be male. But should there be qualified female candidates within a church, then he adds this. In the same way, the women deacon candidates are to be worthy of respect, not malicious talkers, but temperate and trustworthy in everything. Unfortunately, he seems to address the stereotype that women likes to gossip, So he's just trying to make that emphasis. And women, if you're going to be considered as deacon, you have to feed everything that the male deacons have to meet, and just make sure that you control your talking and be very, very trustworthy. So these are the two interpretations of this verse. Okay, but I'm going to wrap up by saying, out of the 12 qualifications deacons, same thing, only one deals with experience. You have to be tested, and only one deals, only one deals with experience. Yeah, nothing really deals with ability. It's really character. It's really character. So now let me end with what's practical to you. And there's many young people in our audience. Now that you learn what the scripture expects out of elders, pastors, and deacons, would you want to be nominated to serve as an elder or deacon in this church in the future, or in whatever church that you're going to be at? It's tough, right? Because we're so used to the world's way of, if I have enough experience, if I have enough talents and gift and ability, then I think I can become a deacon. Or I can maybe even become a pastor if I'm a really, really good teacher and I can learn to be a preacher. But what we learn here is, no, the way God looks at things is the most important thing is your inner qualities, your heart. You got to be somebody who reflects the character of Christ, because the majority of the qualifications is everybody's going to be judging you. But really, the people in the church, the church leadership, pastors, elders, other leaders, everybody's going to be scrutinizing. It's a very, very difficult pressure to be under. However, just like Paul started out by saying, but if you aspire to be an elder, that's a good thing. He ends with this reward. He ends this chapter by saying, those who have served well gain an excellent standing and great assurance in the faith in Christ Jesus. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your word, because as we participate in worship services, as we participate in the life and community of this regeneration church, you teach us what proper doctrine is, and you teach us what the proper conduct of the people in the local church should be. And today you taught us about church governance, and we admit, dear God, that we are so influenced by the way politics and government works in the United States, or within our own company, or within our school system. We are so influenced by judging people, evaluating people, especially if we need to hire somebody, by looking at their experience and by looking at their talents and gifts. Those things are all important, of course, but we learned today of how important you place character of a leader of the church over their gifts or talents. And especially we see that you really place a father's headship of his own family first before they can be a leader of the church. That if a husband or father cannot manage and lead his family, his children respectively, then how could he lead the people in the church? Lord, we ask that you give us grace. You give us grace for those of us who are already elders or pastors or deacons. We know we fall short from your high, high standards. But help us not to fall away thinking, oh, these are too high standards, or maybe I shouldn't have been an elder, or I shouldn't have been a deacon. No, help us to ask for forgiveness where we fall short, and help us to know that it's not based on our own ability, but it's based on obedience to you, your word, and to transform our character to be more like you. And Lord, I pray for, there's a lot of young people here, or even middle-aged people. We never know how you may have led us in our life through our various experiences and the knowledge to be picked up for such a time as that sometimes you might say, like to Moses after he was age 80, okay, now you're ready to lead my people. And so I pray that everybody here will be open to receiving your calling and to prayerfully consider when the call comes whether you want us to serve in a church leadership capacity. We talked about deacons and elders, but any church leadership positions, any fellowship group leader, any ministry team leader, team leader of the AV team, the usher team, the welcome team, the communion team, the praise team, we are all in leadership roles, and we need to really understand this passage, the teaching of this passage, that character is more important than our competence. In Jesus Christ's name, pray. Amen.